So I had told you that we were going to. It's funny. I told you that we were going to do. If you need to do it higher, you push it in and then bring it back. Yeah, if you push it in and then bring it back out. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. I put these on here to stop the pops, little pop, the P's and everything. Yeah. We'll see if it works better. But I told you we were going to do a conversation about materialism or suggested that. And then I realized after the fact that we talked about money for like 2 weeks straight, and basically materialism was one of the things that came up. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, that's an indication that God's dealing with me. God's dealing with me on this, and it just keeps coming back into my head. So not talking about that today, but the thought that you mentioned, and I like it too, because in some people it's exciting. For some people it's exciting. For some people, it makes their heart stop when you say change, life changes, change in life. There's no old quote about everything being on schedule and everything being subject to change. You know, that paradox that we try to make things as consistent and steady as we can, but everything's up in the air.
Yeah, for sure. I think when you think of life, you always encounter those moments of change where change has to happen.
Right.
And sometimes we don't want to do that. And I don't know that anybody ever taught me that. That you've got to look to the seasons of your life and realize that sometimes you're going to have to change things, and this is how you need to go about change or think about change.
Yeah.
Or else you stagnate. And you end up 10, 15 years down the road becoming a person you don't want to be, or you hoped you wouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, change. Yeah, exactly. Because if you think about, even especially for us, and I would say, it slows down. We think it does, or maybe it shouldn't as much, but it slows down as we get older. Obviously, from an infant, from the time a baby is newborn to 2 years old, the number of things that have changed are just unbelievable. I mean, it's just this exponential change daily. There's change every day. They said a new word. They did something new every day. And then we get to this point, in life that we think, okay, everything's kind of steady and stable. And a lot of people get really comfortable with that. And that's the difference between when you say change in someone's life. Some people that produces anxiety because they think, no, I've already had the change. All I wanted in my life. Now I just want things to be steady and stable.
Yeah.
And that's not me as much as it. I mean, I actually... Well, I say I enjoy change until someone messes with my stuff or messes with my world, and or God does, flips something upside down, and I think, oh yeah, I'm excited and ready for change, and then it comes, and I think, oh well, maybe I wasn't.
We like controlled change. When we control the change, you know, sometimes God controls the change.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, change. Often change is so incremental, or our lives begin to change in such a small way over time that if we're not careful to monitor that, we find ourselves in a totally different place than what we had anticipated or what our goals for our life would be. I mean, this morning we were working on some things for a 5-year anniversary for the church,
right?
And someone shared a video of that was taken during our first year of the church, and so I'm looking back at myself and other people, and particularly some of the young people in our church who are now, young adults.
Yeah.
And you think, I don't feel that different, but in 5 years' time, how much different do I look? And
yeah. But I actually have had people come into my shop and they say, "Wow, you look a lot older than you used to, or a lot older than you did in that last television ad." And I'm thinking, well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate you pointing that out. But yeah, I mean, I should, I guess.
Yeah. But just as we age, and it's, I don't feel different, or I don't think I feel different from 5 years ago. In reality, I am different. And so if I have goals that I want to set, sometimes life just takes over, and things just happen, and we're just kind of we're subject to the winds that kind of blow us wherever they will.
Yeah.
If we don't have a plan to begin to become the person that we desire to be, or particularly what I would say is what Scripture calls us to be.
Yeah, and I would say that's probably the biggest. I mean, intentionality versus accidental, like intentional change versus accidental change.
Sure.
We can be, if we're not careful. You know what it is too? It's like everyone knows you if you're not careful, you gain a couple pounds every year.
Yeah.
You know, if you're not intentionally saying, oh, I don't want to gain a couple pounds this year.
Right.
Everyone does.
Yeah.
10 pounds, and you think, okay, if you take that trajectory, that's going to steer you to a very, very different place 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah.
And so it's the same with all kinds of change. I mean, all kinds of things that if we're not careful, disciplines that we used to have, if we let those wander, it's not going to, unless we're intentional about it, it's going to shift one direction. And once it starts, it's going to keep shifting that way, even if it's incremental, And here's the cool thing is that same kind of change, that incremental change. I was listening to a podcast today, and it was a UFC fighter talking about fight, and he said he was talking about the Japanese martial arts, that their focus is 1%. 1% better, 1% better.
Yeah.
If you get 1% better today, 1% faster, 1% stronger, 1%, and whether that's today or this week, 1%. Yeah. And I thought, that's that's kind of what happens in a negative trajectory a lot of times. Yeah. But it can absolutely be the opposite.
Sure.
That 1% change, and if it's intentional, if it's accidental, it almost is always negative.
Yeah.
Intentional, it's usually always positive.
Yeah. Well, the book Atomic Change, which was really, really popular, still a few years ago, it still is pretty popular. But that's kind of its premise is very small incremental change over time that is focused towards bettering yourself. For instance, if I want to start exercising, some people think I've got to be 5 days a week in the gym for an hour and a half, and et cetera, et cetera. Most people don't sustain that. You might start out the first week of January doing that.
It's true.
But you don't sustain that. The premise there is maybe if I just get up and exercise for 10 minutes today, and then tomorrow or next week, maybe I start doing it for 12 minutes and then 15 minutes, and you kind of build yourself in that habit of incremental change. It does move in a positive. It can move in a positive direction. I think, again, sometimes in our life we have perceptions of who we are or whatever, and those lead us to a certain place in life of how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive others around us. And sometimes that's a place that's not very healthy, but we don't realize it until years later when we see more of the full effects of it. So, how do you change at that point in life when you've already kind of embraced habits that now you realize, these are probably not the best things for me for the long term?
Well, I could dye my hair. Thinking about those people that tell me that after having not having seen me for several years, are like, "Wow, you look a lot older." I'm thinking, okay, well, I could correct that with dyeing my hair and getting the gray out, and I don't think that's the right approach. But I think that incremental change is obviously apparent. And that's one of the things too. It's apparent to those people who haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah.
In both ways, whether your hair gets gray over a course of several years and someone hasn't seen you, or you gain a bunch of weight, or you lose a bunch of weight.
Yeah.
Or it's interesting too. And here's the cool thing is that, that incremental change. Let's say you're losing weight. Let's say I lost. I'm losing a pound every month.
Yeah.
But someone hasn't seen me in a year. I guaranteed if they hadn't seen me in a year, when they see me, they'll say, "Oh, wow, did you lose a bunch of weight?" And you're thinking, I didn't really.
Yeah. Because
to me, it didn't make that much of a difference. But it didn't seemingly, it wasn't dramatic.
Yeah.
I think, and maybe we talk about small incremental changes as well as big changes. How do we prepare ourselves for big change? Because there's also the other ones, even the accidental or the circumstantial changes that happen in our lives that are huge. Brandon and I, when we were 28, we had a baby.
Yeah.
I think that was one that it's so funny. You think about preparing yourself. And here's the funny thing is, all those people that were talking to us and taking us through the birthing classes and all the different things, they may have been preparing us in some way, but every one of those who had children, they knew that they weren't even coming close to preparing us, but they knew they wouldn't be able to. They knew that change was so drastic and so not catastrophic, but it's like a meteor hitting Earth. it was so dramatic, that change, that there's really no way to prepare someone for that. You can say, oh, it's going to be, because I tell newlyweds and people that are getting ready to have children, I say, okay, listen, when you were single and then you got married, that change was all like, this is great. This is great. Now I'm spending every day with this person, and it's a little tough sometimes. We sit down to dinner and breakfast and whatever, and the weekends together, and that was all positive, and reasons for losing sleep are very different. And, once you have a child,
Yeah.
it's totally different. It's the whole different. But those large scale changes, I would say, so whether they're positive or negative, is there certain ways that we can prepare ourselves better for those, or?
Experience is such a great teacher,
right?
And I think we can prepare ourselves in some ways, with regards to marriage. I always think premarital counseling is always really good. It's really helpful, but I think it's more or less tucking ideas in until
it's a good point.
Once you get married, you're just trying to tuck some ideas or some thoughts in of how you approach things. Mm-hmm. But a couple is really not going to know until they're like living together, doing life together, interacting with one another, and kind of the newness is sort of wearing off, and now life is kicking in. And then you hope that you're kind of pulling from this reservoir of maybe knowledge that was given to you prior in order to help, or at least that you have a opportunity to connect with people who have the experience that you don't have.
Yeah.
And that's where I think having people who are a little bit ahead of you in the direction that you want to go,
that's a really good point,
is always really helpful in developing life change in positive directions. Like, Paul said in one of the scriptures, follow me as I follow Christ.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Somebody who's ahead, you're watching them, you're seeing their life, they're kind of setting the pace, and you're like, okay, I've got someone who's more experienced than I am, who's ahead of me, but I'm trying to model what's happening. I think that's one of the best ways to begin to create change. But particularly for men, I think to have somebody in theory that you're watching, that's kind of at a distance. Maybe it's a athletic figure or somebody you kind of hold in high esteem. That happens a lot. I think it's probably happens less that for guys, they have someone who they're in actual relationship with and who's kind of mentoring, and they're watching, who's a little ahead, and they're like, I want to model at least some of the characteristics of this person.
And you think about proactive and versus reactive, and obviously on the proactive side, I would say to people who see big change coming. Like for me, it was starting a new business, and I saw big change coming, and like you said, finding someone who's been through that change. Whether it's you're getting ready to have a child, talking to people who have had children, and at least someone saying to you, "Oh, by the way, enjoy your sleep."
Yeah.
Enjoy your sleep up until the day that, I know she's uncomfortable in the bed and tossing and turning, but at least you're both sleeping, enjoy your sleep because it's about to end, it's about to change a lot. Whether it's one of those kind of proactive, and me sitting down with, what I did was sit down with an entrepreneur and say, okay, hey, can you tell me some of the things that I need to be aware of? And that's proactively saying, I got a huge change coming in my life. Yeah. What do you know that I don't? I always said to people, it's not the things that you don't know. It's not the things that you do know. It's the things that you don't know that'll get you into trouble. It's those things that somebody else has already been through this and they know these things, but you don't even know that you don't know them because you've never been in the circumstance before. And so proactively, I think when you see those changes coming, you can at least kind of get ahead of it and say, okay, can you tell me the things that I should be looking for? On the reactive side, when you have something happen in your life that's just huge and you didn't see it coming. I had unfortunately, one of my customers had lost an adult child recently to suicide.
Wow.
And when I talked to him, it's very, very hard for me to talk to someone like that because I can't empathize. Yeah. Right. I can only imagine, and that's all I can do. But I said to him, hey, I don't know if you know this person. but she has been through this the scenario of having losing an adult child to suicide, and she has a foundation. And if that's something that I would encourage you to reach out to her. And he really appreciated that, because that's something that was such a unique, devastating change in his life that very few people can relate to.
Yeah.
And so reactively, I think for a change like that, you got to say, okay, who can maybe help me navigate this a little bit, that has been through this, unfortunately been through this? Because you can't see that coming. No one's going to prepare themselves for that. You can't prepare yourself for that, those kinds of things.
Well, I think you see it on the negative side a lot. Someone is either addicted to alcohol or drugs or other things, and they realize, oh, I'm addicted. I've got to make a life change here. And so what do we normally do? We put them in an environment with other people who are also needing to make a similar life change,
right,
under the tutelage of somebody who's probably been through that but is farther ahead of them in their journey. Someone who can understand, hey, I've been there, I've come through. Because I've come through, you can also come through. So I think having that real life example of someone who's turned the corner, or someone who has gotten the help that they need, or has walked through that journey is really helpful. I think often, particularly if we're trying to make a life change from negative circumstances, we tend to want to hide and keep it quiet, and maybe not share that out. And that's probably the exact opposite of what needs to happen. Kind of when it's churning inside, hey, I need to change, I need to do this. But there's a tendency to kind of keep it quiet until there's either some sort of catastrophic something that makes us have to make a turn. Or if we finally get the nerve to be able to say, hey, I need some help. I need someone to kind of help me, pull me along here.
Yeah, and I think that help comes from people who have been through it.
Yeah.
And obviously, I mean, you reach out to the people that have navigated it well, or have come out the other side of the dark tunnel. I think about all the people that are dealing with depression these days and anxiety, and you think, for those people, find someone who has navigated that and has come out the other end of that dark tunnel. And that may not be the perfect solution for you, but I think, so here's one of the things that I was thinking as we're talking about change. One of the questions I would ask is, what matters and what doesn't matter? What are the things that absolutely matter, and what are the things that don't? What are the things that I want to make sure I'm anchoring myself to?
Yeah.
What are the moorings that I want to make sure that as this change either has happened or is happening, or I'm anticipating it happening? What are the things that I want to make sure that I absolutely hold on to tight as can be, and the things that I'm absolutely willing to let go?
Yeah.
And sometimes we get that wrong. Sometimes we let go of the wrong things and hold on to the wrong things when change comes. And I think so. When you look for somebody who has navigated that well, look for someone who knew what to hold on to.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'd love to talk about some week is long-term friendships. What does it take to build meaningful long-term? When I say mooring, those kind of anchor type friendships.
Yeah.
Because I think so many people don't have that in their life, and a lot of men in particular. I know a lot of men just don't feel like, I would say a lot of men would say that they don't have these friendships that are deep, past the superficial, past the sports and past the fishing and past the whatever, riding motorcycles or whatever, but having deep conversations. And so what to hang on to and what to let go of. Any thoughts there?
There's two thoughts that I have based on what you shared, and one, in terms of what to hold on to, is you have to have, I think, a solid identity in who you are. That's, I think, one of the very key aspects of knowing who we are. And for a Christian, I would say knowing who you are in Christ.
Yeah.
That your value, your worth, your self-perceptions are not based upon what you think of yourself, what others think of yourself, how you perceive yourself, that you're actually genuinely basing who you are and how you look yourself in the mirror in the morning based on the precepts of Scripture and what Scripture says about you, how Scripture articulates who you are. So having a strong sense of identity, I think, is something that we really have to grasp a hold of. The other thing that you mentioned about finding someone maybe who's been through what you've gone through but is on the other side of it. I think I just want to emphasize the on the other side of it point, because I think that's really key.
Commiseration can sometimes be.
If you put a long time ago, someone was sharing with me about dealing with students in a classroom.
Right.
And they made the point that when you put a bunch of third graders together, you get pooled ignorance. And I thought, that's really because you've got kids who are saying, oh, yeah, we're all right.
DC.
We're right. The teacher doesn't know what they're talking about.
Echo
We're
chamber.
right. And we can get that way when we simply surround ourselves with people who are just like us in the same mud that we're in.
Correct.
And you can just be affirming and you never change. You're just kind of spinning your wheels in the mud. So finding someone who's successfully navigated out of that and is on the other side and is in a place of health, I think is really, really important. That we're modeling after that person, and not just someone who is kind of walking beside us, but someone who's actually a little bit ahead of us, who's on the other side. So, again, holding on to identity, and I would say on the flip side of that is also letting go of false perceptions of who you are and what you need to be. We have to root ourselves again as believers, those who are believers, and I don't know what an unbeliever roots themselves in. But for a believer, to maximize our productivity for the kingdom, to maximize our health, is to root ourselves in Christ, which means letting go of unhealthy and unholy perceptions of who we are.
And you said, I don't know what an unbeliever grounds themselves or roots themselves in. That's a really good point, actually. You think about, you think about a ship without an anchor.
Yeah.
Even an anchor that drags along the bottom is and a lot of times they'll do that. And I don't know as much about boating as you do, but drag it along the bottom, even if it's not fastened, and sometimes they can't secure it to something that would hold them in place, but dragging it along something that kind of pulls down and holds them steady, right? I don't know. If someone doesn't know, if someone can't even answer the question, what happens if I get hit by a bus today?
Yeah.
If they don't even have some indication or some idea of, I have some security. I know what happens when I get hit by a bus today.
Right.
Now what happens to my family, because life insurance will step in or whatever, but what happens the day that my heart stops beating? What happens?
Yeah.
And you think if that's not a question, and that's a universal question that every single person, whether they say it or not, has to think about. That is something they have to give some consideration to. So if I can't answer that question, what is that underpinning? Then it's hard to have some kind of anchor, I think.
And I think that's a key question to ask when you think about life change, because life change,
what matters and what doesn't matter.
Yeah. What's the reason for life change? The life change is, I want to get to the end. I would think, you want to get to the end without regrets, without, leaving behind a trail of mess. So you want to change in order to get to the end, in order to maximize the value of life. And again, for the believer, I would say, in order to enter in, I don't want to fade out at the end of my life with a bunch of regrets and sorrows and that sort of thing. I want to walk into eternity with the joy of the Lord in my heart, made full by seeing Him and His glory. Not with a bunch of regrets that I'm glad I made it in by the skin of my teeth. So being born into a sinful world, into a fallen world, means that there are going to be seasons of life where you have to make concerted effort to bring about change. Some of that's going to be not as important, how much I weigh entering into eternity is probably not as important, though I think it's really important right now,
That's right.
but it's probably not as important.
You might get there faster.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But there are other things that are very, very important and very valuable. And again, I'm not saying that's not something that we want to think through a process, but there's other things, I want my children to see me and want to emulate the walk with Christ that I might have and do better.
Yeah. One of the things that's concerning to me is what people, what they let disrupt them and disturb. And I think that's an indication too of that lack of an anchor, lack of moorings. I remember there's this meme. It's a famous meme now that after the 2016 election, okay, we got a different president than the one you wanted. It's a very different president than the one you were hoping for. Okay. All right. But there's this meme of this person like down on their knees, no, like screaming and crying. And you think, okay.
Is that where your hope is?
Is that an overreaction? You think? You think maybe that's an overreaction to what the change in front of you is.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the problems is people without that sense of what matters and what doesn't. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm not saying an election doesn't matter. What I'm saying is sometimes we just have to remind ourselves. I know I have. I mean, I've had some big changes in my life at times. Lost my job one time and had to think, okay, now what? But the things is the sun still going to come up tomorrow? Yeah. Well, doesn't it? I mean, is there still a roof over my head? Yeah, for now there is, right? Yeah. Is there? I still have food in the cupboard. I still have a wife who loves me and kids, asleep in their beds and healthy. Are my kids healthy? Am I healthy? Do I have opportunity in front of me? Do I live in a place where, and all these things, and the funny thing is, a lot of times when change hits us, a lot of times when it's this change that is kind of unexpected and seemingly big, we just have to stop and remind ourselves, okay, what are all the things that I know are secure, right? My eternity is one thing, but even the things that are basic, most of those things, even in huge change, and I don't want to, there are huge changes. Like I said, I mentioned, losing a child to suicide is absolutely one of the most, I can't imagine how devastating this is. I literally can't imagine. I don't want to. But you think, even that, you have to stop and say, okay, I'm still breathing.
Yeah.
Right. And I think I've talked to people before with things like that happen in their life, and they say, even breathing's felt hard, but you have to stop and say, what do I have? What do I know? What do I know is secure right now?
Yeah.
I'm still going to wake up tomorrow, and the sun's still going to be in the sky.
Well, I think about again, as you're sharing, thinking about when you mentioned you lost your job. Now, if I remember the situation there, there was a buyout, and you saw that kind of coming a little bit.
Yeah, I had a month, but yeah.
Yeah. So, but that was a big change.
It was.
And after that happened, you can either kind of let the circumstances overtake you.
Yeah.
Or you can choose to make a life change there. But that life change required you to take a risk.
Yeah.
It wasn't without risk.
Yep.
And, I think sometimes we operate out of fear, not wanting to take the risk because of fear of, I've just lost this. Now I have the potential to lose even more if this doesn't go well.
Yep.
But I think oftentimes it is good to be pushed into taking the risk, to kind of taking a leap of faith and seeing what will happen and seeing what God will do. And I think, that sometimes is a good response to change that comes our way that we can't really anticipate or do anything about.
Right.
Sometimes that pushes us to change in another way, but that requires a risk that we have to be willing to take.
Yeah.
And life is about taking risks at times. And I think when you think about that risk, what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah. What's the worst? That's a great question too. What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
And that's always a good question with worry and anxiety too. People have, what's the worst that could happen? Is this going to kill me? Is this going to, even if that's the worst?
Yeah.
Is that the worst? You know? We were talking about a book that I'm going through the young adult Bible study with, and it's talking about like 3 catalysts of things that happen in my life, and one is circumstances, one is people, and then the other one is internal decisions, internal things that I do. And I think most people that have had dramatic or even traumatic things that have happened in their lives, a lot of them would say, many of them would say, because I've met them and I've had them happen in my life too, is that was the catalyst, that circumstance, or that was the catalyst to something that maybe started from within. Okay, I'm going to change the way I think, the way I act, the way I perceive. And then it turns into something really, really good. And a lot of times people will look back at trauma and they'll say, wow, that was the point at which my life changed for the better. Yeah. Even though that situation was really, really painful and it was very difficult, things got better. And so I would say maybe not that we need to desire trauma in our lives, but at least be open to the fact that hard changes many times produce good results.
And I think that's a biblical concept. The Apostle Paul talks about suffering producing perseverance, and perseverance character hope. That there is this biblical concept of walking through circumstances of life that are traumatic and difficult and whatever, but that producing in us, what he later calls an eternal weight of glory. So it's not that we won't want to run into suffering or want to just run into ways in which we can change things just because we want to have change, but we also have to realize that there are times in life where, you either change or die, and maybe not die physically, but you just kind of burn out. And that's all there is. Yeah. And if you don't change and redirect, you never get to the place where you want to be, the place where God's calling you to be.
Most people the 12-step program people would tell you that the whole bottom of the barrel is where things happen. It's when you finally hit rock bottom. The rock bottom. It's interesting that the rock, when you finally hit the rock bottom, that's where you can propel yourself or do something there. Because you've got nowhere else to go, right? And so I think a lot of times that is what kind of causes change to happen. Is I can't fall any farther. Yeah. Right.
So how do you help somebody who's fallen in?
It's a good point. It's a good question.
The vision that I have is somebody, you're falling in the barrel.
Right.
But you're only halfway down right now.
That's a good question.
How do you stop the bleeding or stop the falling where you don't have to hit, and either lose everything or whatever, where you see it coming, this is coming, I've got to make change. And how do you have a catalyst within yourself to say, this is, I'm changing this because I don't want to be that.
Yeah. Well, I think, rock bottom has different, maybe there's different things that could characterize what rock bottom looks like. I've had many people, unfortunately, just because of my industry, I've had many people that have come into my shop before. This is a common thing, that I purchased something from someone, a young person, and it was them stealing from their parents to buy drugs. That's happened several times throughout the 14 years I've been. And it's almost, and you see it coming. That situation kind of unfolds, and you know what it is. Your child stole from you, which is horrendous, by the way. Most of these parents come in, and it's just, the good news is I know a story. I know of a Christian young couple that I still see from time to time, and their story was that they had gotten into drug abuse, and they were stealing things from his parents and bringing them to my shop, and their life turned around after that. And they got married, and they have beautiful children, and just living this wonderful life. And I think, okay, that's a great story to kind of, when I see these things kind of taking place and happening, It's nice to know that there's some of these stories turn out really well.
Yeah.
But that's something that you see parents come in and here's kind of the fork in the road. And they say, what can I do? I know that my son brought something here and sold it and for drugs. What can I do? I say, well, there's a couple of things. You can either, I can sell it back to you, or you can turn them into the police. And unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, so many times they say, well, I can't do that. And the truth is you can. You can. Yeah. You choose not to. And maybe that's the right call. I'm not saying that it's always the right call to turn your son or daughter into the police. Many times it is, actually. Because I've had parents actually do that they've had to let the police handle it. And I said, because the police can come confiscate it from me and you get it back. But more importantly, you create some consequences for your child that, as painful as it is, might be what they need to be a catalyst.
Yeah.
Without that, is there anything that's going to change their behavior? Probably not.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I've also had parents that lost their children to drug abuse. And yeah, I've had some really sad conversations over the years with parents because I can sympathize. I can sympathize. I've never had addictions in my children. Thank the good Lord. But I can say I understand how much I care for my children and how much it would devastate me if they violated that trust with me, and how desperate I would be if I knew that they were heading down a path towards certain destruction.
Yeah.
And so having those conversations is tough, but where that rock bottom is, or the bottom of the barrel, or whatever it is, maybe it's different for different people too, to create that change. And I think people in Celebrate Recovery would probably have a better, and some of the people that have had addictions, really addictions that threaten their lives, would have a better kind of handle on that than I do.
I think as we would follow someone that we want to emulate, someone who's ahead of us that we want to emulate, I think there's also power in observing people who we don't want to emulate. You can look and see, okay, I'm on a path similar to this person who has already been on this path, and I'm watching their path of destruction. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes if maybe, we're seeing a son or daughter or a young person or someone our own age, who's going down a wrong path, to actually let them see in someone else the consequences of the direction that they're going. Sometimes that may be a catalyst for change that doesn't necessarily require them to hit rock bottom, but helps them to see this is where you're going if you don't now make an effort to turn. I think that can be particularly useful for younger people. I would think it might be useful for older people as well. But I think, maybe that's why, like, when someone's going through driver's ed, they show all the videos and pictures of bad accidents, and stuff. If you don't slow down, this is direction. This is what you're going to be looking at. If you don't,
they bring those cars. A lot of times they'll bring those fatality cars to a school, high schools. I've seen them right in front of high schools. Yeah. The cars that are just mangled. There was a fatality, and they'll slap it down right in front of a high school and just let them know, hey, this is what happens when you're not careful. And I think, it's tough to kind of to catch people in that middle. Yeah. So you're right. It's easy to lift someone off the floor, right? Sometimes because they're ready, they have the hand out. Yeah. Right. But when people don't have their hand out yet, that's when it's really tricky. And I think that's why you had an analogy earlier. And this is not always the case because everyone makes decisions about their own lives. And they don't always listen to good advice. Yeah. But you said, I remember asking someone one time about something had happened with their vehicle, and I said, "Well, wasn't the light on?" And they're like, "Oh, that light? Oh, I didn't think that light was anything." And that was my brother. My brother had something happen to one of his vehicles, and someone was like, "Oh, that light? I didn't really think that was anything." Well, no, there's these indications. There's these small things that you can do. Hey, look, your temperature's high.
Yeah.
A vehicle will tell you, hey, listen, hey, you need to pay attention to this. Pay attention to this now, or later it's going to be more severe. What happens? It's not going to be just a light on your dash.
Right.
And so I think while we need to learn in our own lives to kind of either have those little warning lights that tell us, hey, pay attention, or be that for someone else. And hopefully those people will, pay attention when we say, hey, warning, warning.
Yeah. I think with our kids too, I guess, my tendency is to shield my kids from the ugly underbelly of life at times, don't look over there. Don't see that. Don't get enamored with that. But maybe sometimes it's probably wise to open the door a little bit.
Yeah.
And to say, in biblical terms, this is the path to destruction.
Yeah.
If you want to walk down this path, this is the path to destruction. And so you need to begin to think about changing your attitude, changing your approach, changing your perspective, or else you're going to walk down the path of destruction. So I do think there are those indicators along the way that begin to say, hey, warning, make some changes now. I was on the interstate driving, and I was coming home from a distance, and I knew I had a little bit of gas. I thought I could make it home, and so I'm like 25 miles and the light's on. And then I'm seeing like the countdown of the mileage and trying to calculate. And I'm down to like 3 miles before it's, and it was just like, I was just kind of hoping, okay, I can make it. But there were all these warnings ahead of time. Hey, stop for gas, stop for gas, stop for gas. But I was like,
50 miles, 25 miles.
Yeah. So.
Well, and I think, paying attention to those is the problem, is sometimes we don't pay attention to them. And I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's, we're optimistic, or we are just ignorant, or we're lazy. Yeah. And sometimes it's a combination of all those.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of times we just, when we look back, we say, oh, I should have seen that coming.
Right.
And I think back to the kind of the conversation about change being inevitable. It's inevitable in all of our lives. It's absolutely going to happen. Small changes, large changes, hopefully. I mean, and that's the other thing too, is some people are so anxious about change, and you think, well, don't you want change in your life? I mean, the fact that you're anxious right now, don't you think you'd like to have a change and not be anxious?
Yeah.
You're anxious about change, and how about that change, that you're not anxious anymore? And so maybe one of the things that we could talk about a little bit is kind of changing from anxiety to peace. Right? What do we do? Is there some ways that we can maybe either perceive change or perceive circumstances or whatever, that we can go from a place of anxiety to peace?
You know the backstory and some of this, but there's a time really when I over a particular area, I dealt with some anxiety in life. And I had to get to a point of understanding that, and I didn't understand it in the middle of it. When I was in the middle of it, I knew it was irrational.
Yeah.
I certainly knew that, but I did not know how to manage it. I did not know how to come across or come out of it. How to get my brain in line.
Yes.
With
reality.
With reality of what I knew, kind of how to bring these pieces of my brain together, and the coming out of that for me was learning that I was not trusting the Lord to the extent that I needed to, that I was trying to be in control of things versus allowing God to be in control of things. And I think that's part of what it means to be human, is we can't be in control of everything.
Yeah, we don't want to be either.
Yeah. I mean, and even in our life, when we want to make changes, we should make changes, but we can't always be in control of what gets thrown at us.
Yeah,
and
correct.
So having a high level of trust for the Lord, and also realizing what we shared earlier, the worst of this that could happen is A or B. And if A or B happens, if that's the worst that happens, either I'm I'm now in the presence of the Lord. If it's
Right,
death, you know,
right.
if death is what's coming,
Yeah.
I'm in the, and who, I mean, why do I want to avoid that?
Right.
You know, or something else, you know, trusting the Lord to take care of, and being able to kind of grasp that in my mind was very helpful to kind of come out of those anxious thoughts. On the other side of anxiety, I think we have to be careful what we're involved in, because sometimes we're anxious over things that either because we're pushing the envelope towards sin or towards things that maybe we're anxious we'll get caught in, or other things. And that can also bring, you know, a high level of anxiety. And that's not going to go away until we refuse to do what it is that we're doing that's not healthy and productive
Right,
for us.
right.
You know,
Yeah.
and that is one of the areas that I see pastorally in people. There are some who genuinely have anxiety over certain situations or things, and that's unhealthy perceptions or unhealthy, you know, ideas like what I had certainly about, you know, kind of trying to control a situation or whatever. There's also dealing with people who just are involved in sin, and out of that sin comes a level of anxiety that's unhealthy. And so you have to learn how to change and repent, seek forgiveness, but actually do what repentance means in its most rudimentary form. Let's make a 180, turn around and go the other direction.
Right. No, that's a good point. Yeah, and I think the anxiety about change, it most of the time is grounded in just an incorrect perception.
Yeah.
I mean, anxiety. I mean,
Yeah.
because you think even if you, because I've actually asked that question to people before. I've said, "What's the worst that could happen?"
Yeah.
If the answer is, "Well, you could die," I'm like, "Oh, good." I was thinking it was something
Worse.
like the world comes to an end or everything explodes. I mean, what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
And it's literally, and I know that sounds a little, it sounds a little trite, you know, but and I don't mean to be facetious, but it's when you say what's the worst that could happen, maybe that's sometimes we should ask ourselves that.
Yeah.
Okay, what do I know? I know I have a wife that loves me and kids that are healthy, and you know, what do I know? What are the things that I know? And I think that's one of the things, back to the moorings, I think is I know who holds my future.
Yeah.
So what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
If I know who holds my future, then and it was actually in the Sermon on the Mount. It was in Matthew 6, and Chambers dealt with it the other day, and the other little podcast things that I do for the group is don't be anxious about anything. Don't be and that was in Matthew 6, and he's talking about don't be anxious about what don't worry about your food, your drink, or your clothing. Don't worry about those. And those are the things that we think, food, shelter, and water, we think are the absolute most critical. You think about anybody who prepares for, you know, the apocalypse, you know, food, water, and shelter. You need food, water, and shelter. And Jesus is telling everybody, hey, don't worry about food, water, or shelter. Or clothing. The things.
Isn't that amazing?
And it's funny because that's the one thing we should be worried about, right?
Yeah.
And I think, okay, well then whatever change is coming, whether I can see it or I can't, whether I can be prepared or I can't be prepared for it, I still shouldn't worry about it.
Yeah.
I still shouldn't get uptight about it.
I think it's Psalm 34, I want to say verse 7, but that may not be quite right, but it is in Psalm 34. It says, do not fret, it leads only to evil doing. Do not fret,
That's interesting.
leads only to evil doing. And so that stuck with me too during that season of time.
Fretting leads to evil doing.
Yeah. And so I don't want to have that high level of anxiety, because it leads to evil doing, and I don't want to do evil before the Lord. I don't want to do things that would be displeasing to Him.
Yeah.
And it's not healthy. It's not healthy for us in our perception of God or perception of others. It destroys our relationships.
Yeah.
Or can, So I think being willing to embrace change as it comes instead of fighting against it.
Yeah.
That's why at times I think people can go through life and then they're reaching 40, 50, 60 years old and they're wrestling with their own mortality.
Right.
And anxiety tends to pop up a little bit
Yeah.
because you're thinking, oh, I might die. Whereas when you're 19 and 20, you think I'm invincible.
Right.
But later on, you're seeing some of your friends pass
I still
away.
think that. I'm 50, so one day. No, it's funny you say that. So a couple things. The Serenity Prayer, I wanted to because that's an interesting one. But you were talking about being anxious about things that were irrational. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but one time my son, who loves to climb, and will climb up the face of the rock without thinking. He doesn't really think much about danger behind him or below him. I was climbing with him up the front of Humpback Rocks, if you know that, and we decided to go up the face of the rock, at the front of the rock, kind of the face of the rock, but and I'm trying to follow him. And have I mentioned this before?
No.
I'm trying to follow him, and he's like, yeah, just go the way I went. And he's looking back down at me, and he's just hanging on like he's like, yeah, just your foot right there, just the way I went. I said, I know, I see it. And he's like, yeah, just the way I went. I said, I know, I can see it.
Yeah.
But I can't bring myself to do it.
Yeah.
Like there's something, and I said, I understand it's irrational. Dad, that's not, I get it. I understand it's irrational.
Yeah.
And I'm dealing with that. And the funny thing is, I think I'm starting to tackle that 50 years old. Those fears, I think, are starting to go away, which is interesting because you dealt with that, within the past decade, or whatever. I think I'm just now starting to deal with things. And I don't know if that's doesn't really pair well with the change thing, but the anxiety thing for sure is because what am I afraid of?
We fear change. Yeah.
And the funny thing is, you could run around on balance beams that are a foot off the ground and never think twice about it and never fall off.
Yeah.
But if they're 50 feet up, then it's a whole different animal.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was about the anxiety. But the Serenity Prayer is really interesting. And I don't see it as much as I used to. I used to see it like on people's wall. Lord, help me to change the things that I can change, to accept the things that I can't, and give me the wisdom, or give me the wisdom to know the difference. Is that right? Change the things that I can, accept the things that I can't change.
Yeah.
And the wisdom to know the difference. I think I've just butchered it. I'm sure I did. But I think that's a good kind of way to approach things. I think one of the things that we need to make sure that we are doing, is be a change agent where there needs to be change. That incremental stuff in my own life, or the big stuff, and for other people too. Say, hey, and that's what a good back to the friendship thing. That's what a good friend does.
Yeah.
Hey, I see something in your life that needs to change.
Yeah. There's a book written for organizations called Mission Drift, and it just talks about how
that incremental
small things.
Yes. Harvard was a
You see a lot
Princeton,
of these universities that started out very Christian, very
they
evangelistic.
trained pastors. Is exactly what they did.
Yeah, you follow them over a course, and they drift off of their mission because they didn't focus on the main things. And again, I think sometimes there's an ebb and flow, but we've got to understand and recognize the times when we've got to make adjustments in our course. I know you mentioned boating earlier on. You can set if you're on a ship or a boat, you can set a course.
Right. Same with aircraft.
Yeah, but if you're at the helm, waves are gonna hit you, wind's gonna blow you, or whatever.
It's and constantly
I can remember, my dad would if you understand crabbing and trot lining, you have 1,000-foot of line out, and you're kind of just setting your course and you're following the line, but you're constantly having to adjust because you're getting hit. And I think that's the key, particularly for young people starting out, is be willing and watchful for course corrections over time.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Waves are going to hit, wind's going to blow, but make course corrections quickly. And that doesn't mean that there's not going to be times where you have to make a big, you got to turn around and come back, on the other side of that line. But it's important to be noticing, when you're kind of drifting some, and sometimes that comes through the blessing of other people who are trying to hold you accountable.
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, I see something different here. Your attitude's not been what it was in the past.
Yeah.
Or what's going on? You look different. You look sad. You're, whatever."
And a lot of times, being that person that helps, kind of nudge, can help that person from maybe losing a relationship at the end of that.
Right.
Losing a marriage or whatever. Because sometimes many times, those small corrections can keep the large traumatic, negative
Absolutely.
change from happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good place to wrap it up, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. I'll see if I can. There it is. All right. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.